event.
This link here.
It's on the webpage of the event that my colleagues will now resend you via email also.
Okay. This one that is in
the event is now, we are now launching this event as our last attendee is joining. I see that Santosh has also joined us. Excellencies, dear colleagues, welcome to this new Beat Plastic Pollution Dialogue, a series of events that we have launched before the adoption 2 years ago of a historic resolution at the United Nations Environment Assembly, setting up the path to a global treaty to end plastic pollution. This series of dialogues making links with ongoing multilateral processes to tackle plastic pollution is organized by the Geneva Environment Network in collaboration with the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Convention Secretariat, the Center for International Environmental Law, the Global Governance Center at the Graduate Institute, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs, the University of Geneva, and the governments of Norway and of Switzerland. As you know, the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to develop the international legally binding instrument that was set up following the adoption of the resolution is meeting for its 5th session at the end of this month in Busan, in the Republic of Korea. The Road to Busan event series, organized as part of the Geneva Beat Plastic Pollution Dialogues in collaboration with various partners in preparation of INC 5, is indeed concluding this week. It has provided member states and stakeholders a platform to prepare for the upcoming negotiation by launching new reports and initiatives and hosting briefings and discussions, such as the one we are having today, providing tools for a timely outcome, and we hope ambitious, of this very important negotiation. Since the last INC, we have organized with the co-conveners and the partners 12 sessions. This is the 13th session, and we will have the last one addressing health issues on Thursday this week, which we encourage you also to join. Today's dialogue is organized with the International Pollutants Elimination Network, known as IPEN. We are discussing today the limitations of chemical recycling and other alleged solutions. Before you are formally welcomed, let me remind you that the documents presented, the summary, as well as the video of the event, will be made available as usual on the webpage of this event. Throughout the event, you can raise questions by using the Q&A box. We will use these to feed the discussion during the Q&A session. And I also want to add that the transcript is also available in over 100 languages, as indicated in this new slide. So to formally welcome you, we have the pleasure to have with us, I hope she is already here, Yuyun Ismawati, who is a senior advisor and co-founder of Nexus Tree Foundation, and she's also the co-chair of IPEN. Today's event will be moderated by Lia Esquillo, Director of Programs at IPEN, who will also take the lead after Mrs. Mawati welcoming remarks. And with that, dear Yuyun, very happy to have you with us here, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Diana. I'm sorry for the hiccup. There are lots of technical issues here, like the issue of plastics. There are a lot of technical hiccups and misdeclarations or misinterpretations or even misinformed. I'm so happy to join and open this webinar, which is very timely to our upcoming INC the 5th negotiation of plastic treaty. And as the title said, there are a lot of things happening behind the curtain. And I'm so happy to see there are several speakers in this webinar that will address different aspects of plastics and plastic recycling from a technical point of view, including the politics behind the corporation action or initiatives. I myself witnessed a lot of different kind of implementations of circular economy of plastics, including the use of plastics to be recycled as fuel or refuse-derived fuel, as the pilots of chemical recycling, which is When they launch it in Indonesia, they brag about it, but then silently and quietly close down the facility without any announcement and left many collectors or garbage bank who collected the sachet frustrated, and then eventually they burn all the supplies that's supposed to be feeding that factory. So all kind of this implementations or actions taking place in developing countries mostly with the promise to solve the problems with plastic pollutions that we face. Industry commonly use the words plastic consumption and circular economy to address the problem. However, in the field, we also seen that what they said in the media or in the press release doesn't really reflected in a genuine interventions on the ground. I also witnessed a couple of projects introduced by FMCGs, global FMCGs, to recycle plastics under a facility and obtain plastic credits. But that facility, I know by myself that killed 2 people at least. I said killed because indirectly the activity of that project released a lot of emissions and toxic chemicals from the process. But to get plastic credit for that, I don't think it's a genuine way to recycle and address plastics. So I hope with this discussion we could also have some conversations. How can we push industry to be more genuine in addressing the issue of plastic pollutions, but also we would like to see more how the plastics can be cut, the productions, also the eliminations of chemicals of concern, because they are not only involved since the beginning of the extraction process, but also these chemicals of concerns live and lingering in our lives, daily lives, until the end of the time. And to close this opening, we would like to see more strong and ambitious negotiations in Busan, not only talking about the end of life of plastics, but since the beginning of the plastic production. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar, and thank you for Geneva Environmental Network for organizing this. Over to you, Leah, I believe, who will facilitate and moderate this meeting.
Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Thank you, Yuyun, for that insightful opening and for setting the stage for our discussions. But before we proceed, let me briefly outline the structure of today's session. So first, we will begin with 2 presentations from our guest journalists, Lisa Song and Attila Kalman, who will share their investigative work on plastic recycling and its challenges. Following these 2 presentations, we will move into a panel response where our expert panelists will offer their perspectives from their regions and fields, highlighting technical, policy, and on-the-ground insights. After that panel response, if time allows, we will open the floor for a brief Q&A. But as Diana said, please feel free to submit your questions in the chat box throughout the session, and we will do our best to address as many of the questions as possible. And then we will wrap up and end with some closing announcements. I hope that's all right. Okay, let's get started. Our first speaker is Lisa Song, an investigative journalist from ProPublica, known for her in-depth reporting on environmental and climate issues. Her work, particularly the dilution of advanced plastic recycling, uncovers how the chemical recycling industry promotes solutions that mask environmental and efficacy concerns. Lisa was also part of the team that exposed Exxon's shift from conducting climate research to supporting climate denial, a series that was a finalist for the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. Lisa, it's a privilege to have you with us today. You have 12 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me to talk here. And let's see, do I have control of the slides? I think I do. Awesome. Thanks. I guess I'll just start by explaining a little bit about ProPublica, which is the newsroom that I work at. We are a national newsroom in the US. We're headquartered in New York City, but we have staff and offices all across the country. And our mission is to do investigative reporting. We report on all kinds of topics, everything from politics and business, immigration, abortion rights, education, healthcare, and I'm on a team that covers climate change and the environment. And the common theme in all of our stories is that all of our stories are about accountability. So in every article that we publish, you will find that we're telling the story of how one person or institution or entity has done something to cause harm to another person or group of people or community. And that's sort of the theme in what we do. I have been at ProPublica since 2017, and I specialize in environment and climate change reporting. And for the past year or so, I have been focused on plastic. So I went to INC4 in Ottawa back in April. And earlier this year, I started to specialize in chemical recycling in particular. I got interested in chemical recycling because I was seeing a lot of reports about it. I was seeing a lot of promotion and PR content on chemical recycling, and I just found it to be a very fascinating and complicated issue. I ended up, there are many types of chemical recycling technologies. I ended up focusing on the most popular kind, which is pyrolysis. And I got really interested in pyrolysis because people were telling me about this phenomenon called mass balance, which is this accounting system that is used. And I was told that pyrolysis in particular is very dependent on mass balance. And what mass balance essentially allows you to do is you can have a plastic cup or a plastic product that contains, let's say, less than 1% recycled plastic. But by using the mass balance system, you can market that plastic product as containing 20 or 30 or some other large percentage of recycled content. And it was just a really confusing, intriguing topic, which is what really got me into pyrolysis. And in reporting on pyrolysis, what I saw was a lot of advertisements and press releases saying, this company has made this product out of pyrolysis, so it has recycled plastic in it. But when I called those companies to try and buy the product myself or see it, I could not find real evidence that it was available to the public. So in my article, for example, I open with this example of this plastic cup that had been made by ExxonMobil in collaboration with 2 other companies. But when I tried to buy the cup, I would, go to local grocery stores and stuff and read a bunch of the labels. The companies wouldn't tell me how many of these cups they had made or where in the country they were available or how I could actually get a hold of them. And so that really gave me a sort of extra push to dig deep into pyrolysis. So this first story in the series was all about, what is pyrolysis? How is it dependent on mass balance? What is mass balance and why is this important? Hold on, let's see, are the slides working? Yes. So there were several main lessons in our story. The first lesson is just that pyrolysis is very inefficient. So much less than 50% of the waste plastic that you feed into the pyrolysis process becomes new plastic at the end. So that's just a main theme from the reporting that I found. The second lesson is really going back to the idea of mass balance, which is that once you take waste plastic, put it through pyrolysis and make new plastic out of it, the new plastic products that you make contain minimal recycled material. And what I found was that all of this was very complicated and technical, and we really wanted to present it in a way so that the public could understand. I was discovering that the general public, at least in the US, they barely understand how regular mechanical plastic recycling works. And when they see a bottle sold in the store that says, you know, this is made from 20% post-consumer plastic, they don't actually understand what that means. So the idea of mass balance is much more complicated than regular recycling. And so we wanted to do our best to present it in a simple way so that the public could understand. And to do that, we had to rely a lot on really creative graphics and animations. So this is just one example of a graphic from our story where we're explaining that when you do pyrolysis, you end up turning waste plastic into this naphtha-like product, but you can't make new plastic from 100% recycled naphtha. You have to dilute it heavily with naphtha made from regular fossil fuels that you just dug out of the ground. And so this is showing that at the end of the day, nothing that comes out of pyrolysis physically can contain more than 10% recycled material. And as you'll see later, the 10% is actually a very conservative, generous estimate. So this is just a screen grab from part of the animation that we had in the article showing you how mass balance works. We use a hypothetical, you know, these numbers with the little buttons representing pounds of plastic, kind of to show how the mathematical shuffle of mass balance works. And so in this particular example, we're showing you a type of mass balance called, sorry, let me go back. Type of mass balance called free attribution, which is the type of accounting that would allow you to, you know, take something that has, let's say, 5% recycled content, but through mass balance, you're able to sell it as, you know, 20 or 30% recycled content. So that was the first story that we published in June. And, you know, this story, I think, was read by a lot of people. I myself got a lot of emails from random readers who were, you know, shocked at what we had shown and you know, were hearing about mass balance and chemical recycling for the first time. It's always gratifying to know that people are reading your stories. And then a couple months after that story was published, we saw that the EPA here actually, our Environmental Protection Agency, they made the first federal decision regarding mass balance. In terms of general policies on mass balance, Europe is very much ahead of the United States in trying to address mass balance through regulations. But what we saw in August was that the Biden EPA, they made a rule about a particular sustainable product voluntary program that they have. And the new rule that they passed said, you know, everything sold in this line of sustainable products, if it's made from plastic, it has to be, you know, I think it's like 15% recycled content by weight. And because of the requirement that the recycled content be counted based on weight, it effectively outlawed mass balance. And then after that, I wrote another story because the California Attorney General here, they launched a lawsuit against ExxonMobil, accusing them of deceiving the public for decades when it comes to plastic, and in particular, when it comes to what they were saying about plastic recycling. And there was a particular section of the lawsuit that focused specifically on chemical recycling and ExxonMobil's own pyrolysis operations. And I was very interested in this lawsuit because the Attorney General's office, as part of their investigation, was able to subpoena internal company records from ExxonMobil. And through those records, they explained that the ExxonMobil pyrolysis process creates plastic that has less than 0.1% recycled content. So this was actually orders of magnitude less recycled content than the 10% maximum that I cited in my original article. And, when I was doing my reporting, I didn't have access to internal company records. I was getting sources, from a combination of consultants and academics, and people working in pyrolysis startups, et cetera. So it was really interesting to see that in at least this one real life example, the actual recycled content is so small that it's almost non-existent. So these were some of the stories that I published over the past few months. And then, of course, I actually published this most recent story before the US election. This was back in October, because we had found that there was a new bill introduced in Congress that was at least partly written by a very prominent plastics industry lobbying group here called the American Chemistry Council. And this bill contained a lot of stuff that the chemical industry would really like. The bill, essentially is asking for a lot of government help in expanding and supporting chemical recycling. It would mandate the use of mass balance in plastic recycled products. So we published this sometime last month. And of course, now with the results of the election, it's pretty clear that a lot of the things in this bill will probably be very easy to pass through and occur here in the US. We've all heard and seen some of what the Trump administration wants to do in terms of the oil and gas industry, vastly expanding that industry, slashing all kinds of environmental regulations. I don't know what specific plastic industry initiatives they are looking for, but I think we can extrapolate a lot just based on what they want for the oil and gas industry. So we'll have to see, but I'm sure there's going to be a lot happening here over the next few years. Yeah, I think that is my last slide. Yep, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for your eye-opening presentation. Thank you. Very powerful. Our next speaker is Attila Kalman, an investigative journalist from Budapest with extensive experience reporting across Europe and sub-Saharan Africa. Attila co-authored Wasteland with Investigative Europe, where he sheds light on Europe's recycling shortcomings and the broader implications for circular economy policies in the European Union. Attila, it's an honor to have you here. Please go ahead. You have 12 minutes.
Thank you, Leah, and thanks for having me. I'm really bad with time, so I jump on the topic right ahead. So, as you can read, this was an investigation by Investigate Europe nearly 2 years ago. So the data won't be the freshest, but basically all trends are still the same these days as it was 2 years ago. I think that was just important to mention. And the other thing is that maybe I won't have the most fresh knowledge of the topic because I shifted my focus from plastic to arms in the last 1.5 years. But this investigation took like 3-4 months, and I think we dug really deep, which is a specialty of Investigate Europe, as we are 15 journalists in 13 countries all over Europe. And I could relate to Lisa because we also have this accountability issue when we are reporting, but we want to take account of the European institutions. That's why we do our stories, and that's how we want to put this European puzzle together. And this was the situation with plastic as well. Actually, we had a very simple question back then. We just wanted to know what happens with all the plastic waste in Europe. And this was important to us, and I think for everyone, because back then, before the war in Ukraine, you could hear many speeches about how European economy will be circular in a few years, and that European economy will be just a closed loop, and everything will be recycled anyhow. And we just saw it was not really happening, and we wanted to have a very clear example with plastic. And for this to show, I brought 4 very simple graphs. We can have the first one, so we can change the slide. Yes. So I think that's very important to see that when we talk about the plastic pollution, it's not merely mainly a waste issue, it's an overproduction issue. If you just see this graph, which is a projection for the future by OECD, you see how the expansion is just growing year by year. And I think it's just a mind-blowing fact that in 20 years, between 2000 and 2019, 66% to two-thirds of all plastics ever produced globally, it was produced in those 2 decades. And I just assume that it's very easy to see that if we are producing this many plastics, and most of it are plastic packaging, which is the main problem, it's just an illusion that we will anyhow recycle all of this. As Investigate Europe, we have a very European focus, so I will most talk about the European situation. I think that as the European Union envisions itself and promotes itself as it's in the forefront of the green transition and green economy, and we see that how dire the situation in Europe is, you can also assume that how the situation elsewhere globally. But we also have to say at this graph that from this plastic production, only 15% is produced in Europe, and most of it is right now produced in China. And we can have the next graph, please. And this graph shows that when you can just show it to any lobbyist who is advocating recycling. So this shows that, yes, they are right when they are saying that recycled plastic production is growing, but you can just see how virgin plastic production outgrows it. The percentages are not lying. It's like all plastic production right now, or when we did it, so in 2019-20, when the data is from, around 10% of all plastic production was recycled plastic. Why is that? It's a very simple reason. Virgin plastic is just much more cheaper to produce. And European policies and tax policies also not really helping recycling in this regard. So when someone wants to produce plastic, it's just way cheaper for the company to produce new plastic and not to recycle it. Problem here is also that when we are talking about recycling, and you have materials as paper or different kind of metals or even glass, basically 100% of those can be easily recycled. With plastics, it's very different. One thing is that some plastics are very expensive to recycle them. But the major problem here was with plastic packaging recycling, because even though there are certain measurements that that packaging has to be made from one type of plastic, there are no real penalties and no real danger if someone is not abide to these policies. And when you have mixed plastic packages, it makes it just nearly impossible to recycle those because, for example, different kind of plastics have different kind of melting points, and there are just problems with it. The other issue is, and this is not coming from me, this is coming from Helmut Maurer, who was the EU Commission's Circular Economy Directorate official, who we interviewed for this topic. And after he retired, he was very open about that he was very critical of this whole circular economy, even when it comes to plastics. So he said that plastics will never be circular. It's because of this thing that how plastic is degrading through oxidation as a petrochemical product. You always have to add additives, virgin plastic when you recycle it. So after a while, only downcycling will be an opportunity, and that's also more expensive than produce virgin plastics. We can have the next slide, please. And this shows that why plastic packaging is the real problem. If you just right now look around in the room where you're at, you see a lot of plastic, but those plastics are usually used for many, many years. This is not the same with plastic packaging, which you just throw away after you use the product it was packed in. And just in Europe, the average of this plastic packaging waste production per capita averagely by year was 35 kilograms. I think it's maybe easier to imagine if we calculated that means 1,070 half-liter PET bottles per person. That's how much plastic waste an average citizen of Europe is leaving behind per year. And even Germany, with the biggest population in the European Union as a country, was producing nearly 40 kilograms of plastic packaging, but the worst in this regard was Ireland with more than 60 kilograms. And this plastic packaging waste which is piling up as plastic waste, what you see mostly around yourselves. And even in Europe, where we are saying that we have a target for 2025, 2030, we couldn't reach those targets and there was no real push for it. So this meant in 2020 that around 60% of all plastic waste was not recycled. But what happened with this 60%? And the last slide will shed some light on it. So we can have the last one. So there was a very important moment when China banned plastic waste imports in 2018. Before, most of this waste was just easily from European ports sent to China to do whatever they want with it. And after this ban, basically it was not an option anymore. We were, with Investigate Europe, tried to cover illegal trade routes as well. What we found, it was basically they are still in place and there's a lot of illegal waste exports, but in quantities is just a few percents right now. The biggest percentage of plastic waste export was legal and was mostly going to China. Afterwards, these waste export routes a little bit shifted, but also went down a lot in quantities. After the ban, Turkey was the main importer of European plastic waste. Around 40% of all plastic waste exports from Europe went there, which was an issue because of the mismanagement of waste in Turkey, where what we found, and local campaigners also actually fighting against it, is that when it was claimed that this plastic waste will be recycled, many times it was just burnt in the open air. What really happened in Europe was that after the ban, incineration started to grow very quickly. And just to see the scope of it, just in Poland, there are plans to build nearly 40 incinerators in 10 years. And you can see this everywhere around Europe, that incinerators are growing in numbers because the plastic waste is just mounting up everywhere, which is not an issue because of pollution firsthand, because these inventive new filters are actually very well filtering out all the pollutants from plastic and other type of waste incineration. But the huge problem is, which was on the first slide, as how we have this hunger as humanity for plastic, and we just need more and more. And if we incinerate our plastic waste, that means that more virgin plastic have to be made, which as a product made from fossil fuels and petroleum, as the UN Environmental Program already calculated in a publication from 2021. This will mean that plastic production will cause 15% of all CO2 emissions by 2050. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Attila, for your excellent presentation. And thank you, Lisa and now Attila, for your powerful presentations, for digging deep, and for uncovering the truths behind these technologies, or behind the mirage, as Lisa called it. Very powerful. Your investigative work is important, invaluable in helping us understand the realities and challenges in addressing plastic pollution. Thank you both. Now let's move on to our panel discussion. Our panelists will respond to the presentations, to the findings presented by our journalists, sharing their insights, not technical insights, regional perspectives on waste management, recycling failures, and viable policy approaches. So I'll just introduce our panelists. First, Lee Bell. He is the Technical and Policy Advisor at IPEN. Lee will address plastic waste management hazards, including challenges associated with chemical and mechanical recycling, the rise of RDF, or the refuse-derived fuel in waste management, and tactics used by industries to address plastic waste. Eileen Lucero, National Coordinator of Eco Waste Coalition in the Philippines, will share experiences from her region and country, particularly the challenges in managing plastic waste and potential policy recommendations from a Global South perspective. Santos Virgilio, Technical Advisor from Angola's Ministry of Environment, will discuss the threats posed by these technologies in the African context. And finally, we will have Professor Bethany Carney Amroth from Gothenburg University, representing the Scientists Coalition for an Effective Plastic Treaty. Bethany will provide data and insights on chemicals in recycled plastics. Thank you in advance already, our dear panelists, for joining us. So let's start with Lee. Lee, you have 7 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Leah, and thank you for inviting me to take part today. I'd like to talk to a number of the issues that have been raised by our previous speakers around the management of plastic waste, and particularly in relation to a report we developed in 2021, Plastic Waste Management Hazards, where we started to consider not just issues like incineration and waste to energy, but also chemical recycling and plastic fuel development, and what was happening with that. And one of the things that we found in relation to these management methods was that there was very little information coming out of chemical recycling in terms of the yield. That is the amount of useful material that they were getting from pyrolysis, but also solvolysis and other treatment methods that they were considering. Very little information. Lots of publicity, lots of media releases, lots of investment announcements, very little product being claimed or being available in terms of statistical analysis. And from the work that we've done since then at IPEN, we found that what Lisa was saying earlier about the amount of material you can actually use and feed from chemical recycling into petroleum crackers, steam crackers, is very low indeed. And that figure of 0.1% is probably quite accurate. And a maximum of 2% of the material coming post pyrolysis can actually be used for new material at the end of the day in terms of plastic. Next slide, please. There's a reason for this, and as it was also pointed out, plastics are not circular and cannot be circular due to two main problems, and that is their toxicity and their immiscibility. The toxicity is created by chemical additives that all polymers require. They cannot have the properties that are demanded on the marketplace unless they have these chemical additives basically impregnated into them. What we also know is that different polymers don't mix well together, and this is also a problem in mechanical recycling because the polymers have different melting temperatures. They just don't bond together well, and the end product, if you mix the polymers, is low quality and has limited uses. So these are two of the key problems we find with recycling, whether it be mechanical or chemical recycling. And you can see here in the graphic that a couple of the main problems we have is that the waste management methods are either incineration, dumping in landfill, exporting as a guise for recycling, or converting them into fuel. And some of the issues we've seen most recently with the fuel aspect is that some of the chemical fuels being made from plastics are horrendously toxic. They have something like a 1 to 1.2 ratio of risk, public risk, which means basically that anyone who's exposed to this material is likely to get cancer. And I think the US EPA has actually prevented that chemical fuel from going ahead. But this is some of the problems we face when you try and convert plastic wastes into other materials as part of the waste management process. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. The key to the problem is plastic additives, a $50 billion industry projected to reach $80 billion by 2030. And the increase in plastic additives markets are related directly to plastic production. And the toxic additives, we know there's something like 16,000 chemicals being used in plastic manufacture, and over 4,000 of those are hazardous to human health. Many of the others haven't been researched in terms of their hazard. And it's these plastic additives that cause problems, both in mechanical recycling, where you see toxic chemical additives being recycled through the mechanical processes and ending up in products where they shouldn't be. Children's toys, kitchenware equipment, where you're going to have high exposures to these chemicals. You see electronic waste chemicals entering into other recycled plastic materials. When you come to chemical recycling, this is what causes such a fundamental problem with materials like pyrolysis oil, and why they are limited in terms of why you can put them through a steam cracker, because the contamination rates on that hydrocarbon oil from pyrolysis are so high. And they have to be diluted with vast amounts of virgin naphtha from virgin petrochemical extraction. So there is never going to be circularity or sustainability in an industry where you have massive dilution using virgin fossil fuels. Next slide, please. And so it brings us to the toxic plastic recycling stream and the sorts of toxic exposures you can expect right through production, and then to the point where you look at waste exports, where millions of tons of plastic waste is still exported, and you have contamination and exposure issues for the workers handling those materials, for people coming in contact with them on a daily basis. And as I mentioned, when you move on to recycling that plastic into products, and IPEN has many, many reports on this issue, where you see consumer goods like toys, games, kitchenware, heavily contaminated with banned chemical substances that are entering the recycling chain. And then when you do finally reprocess those end-of-life materials into plastic recycling facilities again, you again expose workers in the plastic recycling facilities. You generate very large amounts of hazardous waste. And this is one of the Achilles heels of chemical recycling, is that by definition, you have to remove toxic chemicals where possible to try and create a pure monomer or polymer. And the rest of that material, which is largely chemical additives, but also other chemical materials, ends up becoming a vast hazardous waste stream from chemical recycling. And a recent report by Professor Quicker for the Swiss government on chemical recycling mentioned a very important point, which is if you were to establish chemical recycling facilities in developing countries that don't currently have the ability to manage hazardous waste, you are simply going to end up with a new magnet for plastic waste recycling exports, and creating a vast hazardous waste stream that can't be managed in those countries. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. Just a couple of quick words on refuse-derived fuel, which is one of the last resorts of plastic waste management. Refuse-derived fuel is flying under the radar worldwide. There's imports, exports, and developments at domestic national level in most countries that IPEN has researched this issue. And it's basically about pelletizing or turning plastic waste into bales, burning it in cement kilns, burning it in incinerators and industrial boilers. There's nothing circular or sustainable about burning plastic waste. You can't burn your way out of climate change, despite all of the creative accounting that goes into suggesting that using refuse-derived fuel is somehow going to lower your carbon emissions when it has a very high plastic waste content in it. And we would like to see the Basel Convention define this material as a hazardous waste and restrict its transboundary movement. But more than that, we'd like to see it phased out altogether. Last slide, please. Thank you very much for your attention. And if people would like to have a very detailed look into chemical recycling and why we believe it's a dangerous deception, please follow the links, and you're welcome to look much further into the issue as IPEN and Beyond Plastics produced this report in October last year, which is quite definitive on the issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee, for your very insightful presentation. Thank you, Lee. Now we move to Eileen. Eileen, we are excited to share to hear your perspective on the challenges you face in the Philippines and some of your thoughts on the ways forward. You have 7 minutes. The floor is yours.
Leah. Yeah, thank you, Leah, and thank you everyone for inviting me to share what is happening in the Philippines, especially in the waste management we had. So, okay, so okay, so uh-huh. Okay, hold on. Okay, so the Philippines is frequently singled out as one of the top sources of plastic pollution. Often we are dubbed as the sachet economy because of our heavy reliance on small single use packaging. This massive plastic waste leads to environmental degradation, affecting marine ecosystems and public health. The Philippines is considered one of the main contributors to marine plastic pollution, with over 500,000 tons of plastic waste entering the seas and oceans annually. So, in the Philippines, we are as consuming 3 million tons of plastic that we use annually, with sachets accounting for 52%. But what is lacking? It's corporate accountability and transparency. The Philippines is as the sachet economy in Southeast Asia. But here's the paradox: the Philippines doesn't produce most of these plastics. We are not a plastic producing country, and it is really creating challenges on how this waste ends up. If you would just see in this slide, these plastic packaging are being produced by major manufacturers. And some of these major manufacturers can be found in the global north. Thus, there is toxic double standard in trading approach, including those banning some products because of their impacts on public health, human rights, animals, and the environment. They do not apply when the goods produced in their country are meant to be exported. No, then it will be used and distributed, consumed in other countries. For example, the polluting single-use plastics and other goods that cannot be put on the market in the global north are subject to a loophole that allows companies to still produce and export them from the global north to the rest of the world. No? So this is the reality. No? Despite countries in the global north positioning as a leader in sustainability, safety, and environmental protection, its efforts remain confined within its borders only, with little to no external considerations of its impact to other countries. The the global conversation often pushes advanced solutions like chemical recycling, mass balance approaches, and recycled content that mandates as the primary answers. No? Yet these solutions don't always translate to our context. It's business as usual for them, while we at the global south are polluted with their waste. We don't want these quick fixes to our woes. This proliferation of false solutions like RDF, waste to energy, chemical recycling, plastic offsetting, plastic discards are not genuine solutions. We cannot burn bury or recycle our way out of this problem. So, what do we want in this country? Plastic pollution is a global problem, and the global south should not bear this burden alone. We need international support and funding for waste management solutions that work in our context. Solutions that go beyond export and forget. For those delegates attending the international negotiations on the Global Plastic Treaty, they must aim for a high ambition global treaty on plastics to solve these inequalities. A global plastic treaty that put health and the environment at the forefront of every country, and not the business as usual agreement that will only benefit producing countries. With the massive plastic pollution that is happening now, it is really time to turn off the tap in plastic production. So thank you very much, Leah.
Thank you very much, Eileen. Thank you for sharing with us the experience of the Philippines and stark realities, no, on the ground. Thank you. Now we move on to Santos. Santos, we are eager to hear the African region's perspective. You have 7 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you. I will try to make it in less than 5 minutes.
Please take your time.
Yeah, I hope that you can hear me properly.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, first of all, to say that most of the African countries are just recipients of plastic products. We don't produce, but all African countries are already suffering the consequences of plastic waste. When it comes to the process, the international negotiation for the legally binding instrument, we need a better understanding of what is needed, what is meant by full life cycle approach, because we very much agree with the resolution, meaning that okay, we cannot just tackle the plastic at the end, but we have to address the full life cycle of plastic, beginning for the primary plastic polymers and other important issue to be properly addressed is the product design and also the supply. We in Africa, we advocate that we will not have a robust instrument if we don't make provision of the means of implementation. What we mean by that, have financial resources. We're advocating to have a standalone fund following the structure of following the model of Montreal Protocol, because the problems are almost the same, being spread worldwide, and the only way that countries like African countries, developing countries, they need resources to deal with the problem. About recycling versus circular economy, we in Africa, we are very much aware of the traps behind the recycling of plastics. And usually we respond to those that have been promising to us that they are very safe chemical recycling, that you cannot swallow poison, believing that you have the antidote, because this is not a wise way of thinking. Although that you believe that you have the antidote, but you will not swallow poison because you are sure that you have the antidote. So for those that are promising that there is safe chemical recycling of plastic, we are afraid of that. We don't want to take that risk. Another aspect that we have been addressing that we want to be reflected in the new instrument is the illegal traffic of plastic, which is hidden under the flag of recycling materials. Okay, people are willing to bring the issue of recycling, but hidden there is something that is suspected is the illegal trade of plastic and plastic waste. And one other aspect is the legacy plastic pollution. They have to be addressed in the new instrument. So these are the main issues of our region, African countries. So, well, we are going to Busan with good spirit, but we are looking to address all these issues. And if we have a collaborative spirit, we'll get a robust and a very good instrument that will address the problem of plastics in the world. So this is, in summary, what I wanted to share with you. Hope that you got me, and I'm ready to answer whatever question can come after this.
Thank you so much, Santos. We did get you. Thank you for emphasizing and summarizing the most important points for Africa, including the full life cycle approach in addressing the problem of plastic pollution, the importance of financing, the need to address legacy plastic pollution, your critique also on recycling, and we share your hope to have a robust and truly meaningful instrument. Thank you again, Santos. Now we move on to our last, but not the least, panelist. I'd like to call on Bethany. Bethany, you have 7 minutes. The floor is yours.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I think I have some slides here too. So I'm a scientist in Sweden, and I'm also one of the co-coordinators of the Scientist Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty. So we've been engaging quite a lot in this process around the treaty negotiations. But today I'm going to talk about chemicals and recycled plastics. I will be reiterating some of what we'd heard before about why circularity is so difficult with plastics. And I'm starting just with a picture from one of my favorite artists, Ben Van Wang, who has created this image of a mermaid and all these water bottles that we're supposedly recycling. And as we've heard before, packaging is one of the most common uses of plastics, or it is the most common use of plastics. And I think I can change the slides myself. There we go. So I just wanted to set the scene a little bit, and we've heard a bit about this, but we know that the plastics market is very complex. And this is an image from a publication by Levy and Cullen in 2018, showing the flows of petrochemical products through different value chains, different supply chains. And what we see here is a very complex system that is plagued by high levels of complexity, low levels of transparency, and significant knowledge gaps. So we don't really have a good idea of all the things that are being produced and where they're going and where they're ending up. Then we have my next image, which shows, it's also from a publication in 2022 showing global plastic waste flows. And we don't always necessarily know where our plastic waste is going. There have been new decisions in the EU to ban export of mixed plastics waste, for example, to non-OECD countries, but we know that there's a big black market or missing data on where all of these plastics are going. We also know that there are few or almost no regulations controlling the import of secondary or recycled plastic pellets. And finally, there's very little reporting on chemicals in these products, save for the substances of very high concern, which within at least REACH, for example, require reporting. So a lot of complexity on both ends. This is from a paper that was published earlier this year that some of you may be familiar with, the PlastChem report, looking at the chemicals in plastics. And we heard from a few of our earlier speakers about these chemicals. But the number that we're putting it at today, and this increases every time a new report comes out, is 16,000 plastic chemicals that are used in plastics, production in plastics products. And we know that more than 4,200 of those have hazardous properties. That's the circle with the blue and red on one side of your screen, and that more than 10,000 of those chemicals lack hazard data. Now, if you look on the right side of your screen, you'll see the kinds of toxicity that we're talking about around the plastics that we know where we have hazard properties, and that's aquatic toxicity and specific target organ toxicity, cancerogenic, mutagenic, reproductive, toxic, endocrine disrupting chemicals, persistent, bioaccumulative, mobile, and toxic chemicals. These are all being being used in plastics production. And as I said before, there's very little transparency, there's very little traceability on how these chemicals are being used, where they're being used, and how they're moving through products' value chains. This data is from a study that I did together with a number of my scientific colleagues and some scientists from the IPEN network, where we collected recycled pellets from the global south, mostly from 13 different countries. These were collected in small-scale mechanical recycling facilities. And again, highlighting the fact that mechanical recycling is currently the most common form of recycling. It requires the least amount of energy, and it's the most easily accessible. So it entails collecting plastics, sorting them, chipping them, and melting them down and making new pellets. And what we found in this study is that not only do the plastics contain additives that we know that are being put into plastics, like flame retardants and phthalates or plastic softeners and pigments, we also find a lot of other chemicals. So we use two different chemical analytical techniques to do this work. On one side, you have a target screening, and the other side, the non-target screening. Details around this are in the publication. But what we're emphasizing in these results is that we're finding a lot of other chemicals. We're finding things like pesticides and pharmaceuticals, PVCs, and chemicals that should not be in these plastics if they're being used for products that humans will come into contact with. So we can see that not only do we have a lot of unknowns around the chemicals and the products flowing into the waste streams, but we also have a problem with contamination. So there are chemicals that are sorbing into the plastics during their life cycle at some point, maybe during the use phase, maybe during the waste phase. And these are in the recycled products, which means that they will be in whatever we're using to manufacture out of these recycled plastics. And as we also heard earlier, we find these kinds of chemicals in products like toys or food contact materials that are made from recycled plastics. This is problematic. We're currently doing toxicity testing on these materials. So some of our early evidence is pointing to impacts affecting like algal growth, affecting lipid metabolism, fat metabolism in fish larvae. So we know that they're toxic. We know that these plastics contain hundreds of chemicals, sometimes at very low doses, but the mixtures are quite problematic. And if this is a really big if we're going to recycle plastics, and a lot of the models looking at solutions to plastic pollution say that we need to recycle plastics, we have to do it better, because the way we're doing it right now is not working. It's introducing toxic chemicals and cycling toxic chemicals through our so-called circular systems. If we want to recycle plastics, we have to do a number of things to make it safer and more sustainable. So we need to reduce the numbers and types of chemicals, especially hazardous chemicals that are used in products, applying the principles of chemical simplification. We need to increase reporting, transparency, and traceability throughout the entire life cycle, so we know what chemicals we're dealing with and where they're going. This might also require different, more sector-specific waste streams to make sure that we're not mixing chemicals that would be problematic in new products. We need to do more monitoring, testing, and quality control of recycled plastics. This is all going to require economic incentives. And here I use the words waste hierarchy. And if you're familiar with the waste hierarchy, you'll know that recycling comes quite low down on that list after reduction, and then other systems like reuse and refill and remanufacturing. And finally, we need to consider a just transition for all of the people that are affected throughout this entire life cycle, including waste pickers and people working in recycling plants. We know that toxic chemicals are released in the plants, and we also know that micro nanoparticles are released. So there's a lot of exposure scenarios for the workers, but also for consumers that are using these plastics materials. And with that, I think I stayed in my time limit. I will end, and you'll find there on your screen a QR code that will lead you to the Scientist Coalition's page, where we have our outputs, where you can read more about a lot of our different consensus statements, fact sheets, and policy briefs relevant to plastics and plastics policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bethany, for your powerful presentation. Thank you for all the data, the insights you presented. Very powerful. And thank you also to the Scientist Coalition for your active engagement in the negotiations. Very helpful to the different countries, different CSOs as well. Thank you. And I'd like to thank again our esteemed panelists for all your thoughtful responses and presentations. Now we have everyone did well in time management. So we have a good few minutes for questions, no, from our audience. So we can look through some of the questions that are posted. Some have been answered. Thank you. Let me take this one as a start. So as many speakers have pointed out today, plastic has been overproduced. And much of the chemical recycling promoted by plastic manufacturers is actually unfeasible. So, is it meaningful for companies to promote circular recycling and post-consumer recycled PCR plastic products? Or is this just a self-deceptive, collusive scam? Lee, you want to take first crack at that? You started to answer also in the
Yes,
chat.
sure. Look, my blunt assessment on it of this particular promotion by plastic industry associations is that it's the same type of campaign we saw in the 1980s when there was first discussions about putting limits on production of various single-use plastics in the US, and the American Chemistry Council and other lobby groups pushed mechanical recycling of plastic as the solution and the alternative to tighter regulation on production. As a result of that, they weren't regulated, and they've had decades of overproduction as a result. Mechanical recycling of plastic has failed to produce more than 9 or 10% recycling of the entire plastic production. So what we're seeing now is really round two of this kind of propaganda. As we head into the plastic treaty, the petrochemical industry and its associations are simply trying to gamble that promotion of chemical recycling and similar measures will prevent any serious regulation of their production limits from taking place. And they're doing this because they know their days are numbered in terms of fuel and their carbon liabilities, and they're putting all their bets on plastic and petrochemical products associated with plastics to maintain their profit.
Thank you, Lee. Anyone else from the panel who want to chime in on the question? If not, we can go to the next. Yeah. Are there plastic chemicals that are not hazardous? Are there safe chemicals that go into PPE?
So if I just take a quick crack at this question, the PlastChem report documented something like 160 chemicals that were labeled as not hazardous, but those assessments were based on incomplete data. And then as you saw in one of the slides that I had, more than 10,000 of the chemicals lack data, and more than 4,000 were identified as hazardous or having toxic properties. So that's a very difficult question to answer. I think given the knowledge gaps and the data gaps that we're facing. There, as I said, 160 some odd chemicals that were assessed based on insignificant or insufficient data. So not that we know of right now is the answer. Probably, maybe, something, but not that we know of right now.
Thank you, Bethany. Anyone else from the panel who want to answer that? Who want to reflect on the question? If not, we will go to the next. Okay. There's another question. Is there any use or case for mass balance that is helpful, effective for plastic recycling, given the challenges that surround it? Because of the challenges that have been discussed.
Yeah, I can take that. I mean,
Lisa, please.
there are many types of mass balance. And, there are some that are less extreme and some versions that are more extreme. And I believe Europe at least has started regulating mass balance and, not allowing certain types and allowing other types. I know that here in the US, we are so far away from being able to regulate the nuances of mass balance because most people here have never even heard of mass balance or even understand what chemical recycling is. So, you know, I think that eventually will be a question the policymakers can decide, but we're sort of so far away from being able to have a reasonable conversation on that it's a little bit it's a little bit too far ahead of what we're ready for here. I know that after my pyrolysis piece came out, I heard from a lot of readers who were just shocked at the very idea of mass balance, and they all told me they thought it was greenwashing. So again, how much of this is going to be public education? How much of it is practicality in terms of different types of chemical recycling? I personally focused on pyrolysis because it is so utterly dependent on mass balance, and in particular, so dependent on the most extreme form of mass balance, which is free attribution. I believe there are other forms of chemical recycling, like some type of solvolysis maybe, or some of the techniques that other companies are using that could depend less on mass balance. And we'll just kind of have to see how that shakes up. I know that the New York Times did a really interesting story on another company, Eastman, that uses a different type of chemical recycling. And even though their technology should be less dependent on mass balance, they did in the end use, one of the pretty aggressive forms of mass balance. So whether that's just a marketing preference for them or a real technical limitation is a little bit unclear.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the answer, Lisa. So maybe we can take on just two more questions so we can end in time. One is more a comment, but maybe someone would want to reflect on it. I just want to say I really do not like the word safer plastics because I do not think plastics can be made without the toxic, harmful chemicals making it. So there is no such thing as safer plastics. So it's more a comment. Later, I will invite whoever wants to, from the panelists to reflect on that. But I'll also mention already the last question that we will tackle during this open forum. When you look at hazardous chemicals, why prefer hazard-based classification over risk-based? Does trace amounts of PFAS in a semiconductor and internal plastic piece require the same regulation as more direct exposures? So two things, safer plastics and then the hazard-based versus risk-based classification. Panelists, anyone?
I don't know how to put my hand up. Can I put it up like this?
Yes, I can see your hand up. Bethany, go ahead.
So when it comes to the term safe, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to designate a product as safe. Given the lacks of data and given the potential uses and given the time spans that we're talking about, plastics exist for time spans that are longer than human lifespans. So I don't think we can designate plastics as safe. When I try to think about how we work with plastics, I try to think of them as potentially being safer and not sustainable, but more sustainable. I think then instead of using the word safe and sustainable, again, because we can't designate something as safe. And what we can try to do is try to ensure that plastics contain less and fewer known toxic chemicals and hopefully work with pre-market solutions that would prevent using anything that hasn't been properly vetted and tested, and that requires criteria and standards and testing methodologies that will need to be harmonized across markets and across countries. We also need to look at how we're using plastics, where we're using plastics, whether or not we need them at all. So I think, again, going back to the waste hierarchy, reduction is the very first step that we need to take. That was the answer to the first question, and I'll see if anyone else wants to jump on that or get in on the second question. If not, I have an opinion there too.
Go ahead, please.
So when it comes to working with hazard versus risk, so a hazard-based assessment would allow you to look at chemicals or materials and identify whether or not they have hazardous properties and then regulate them according to those alone. When you're adding risk, then you're adding the component of exposure. And as was the example here, I think in a specific product, you would look at a specific chemical in a specific product and try to assess the risk of exposure there. And risk has traditionally led to delays in policy decisions because it does require more information, it requires more assessments, it requires more knowledge about the fate of the chemicals once the product comes onto the market. And a lot of times our risk assessments are done in a post-market approach after the exposure has already occurred. So you're already allowing for people in the environment to be exposed, measuring the concentrations, comparing those back to toxicity data, and then trying to regulate them after the fact, which of course is undesirable and problematic. And then there's a second aspect to this where a chemical might be used in one product in one place, and that chemical and that product might not necessarily stay in that one product or that one place, especially if we're talking about circularity and moving into a more circular use of materials in society, because then we would have to do new risk assessments for every time that chemical or that product is revamped into a new product. And that creates, again, more burden and more data requirements. So the whole idea of using a risk assessment might be applicable in some places, but it also is much more burdensome, requires much more data, and oftentimes allows for chemicals to be released onto the market and used, and resulting in exposures, which we then try to regulate after the fact. A hazard-based assessment would ideally prevent that from happening. So, or hazard-based regulations, I should say. Which hopefully in the future will be group-based and not on an individual chemical basis, because we now know that there's something like 350,000 chemicals registered for global production, and it takes something in the order of a decade to regulate one chemical at a time, and we don't have the time to be doing this one chemical at a time anymore. We can't do this. We need to be working with a group-based approach based on hazardous properties of the chemicals. Muting myself.
Thank you for the comprehensive answer, Bethany. Anyone else want to add any points, any additional reflection or answers to the questions? Okay, one more, last question. So, what then is the motivation of chemical recyclers? Is it just greenwashing or continued plastic production? Because it doesn't seem to be economical.
I might have a go at answering that one. It's not economical, and in our chemical recycling study in the US, we looked at 11 constructed facilities that were constructed, and we didn't say operating because there was very little evidence of anything coming out of them of any use. And since we conducted that study, 2 of them have now shut down due to economic problems, and we believe the others are having similar issues. And it comes down to the issue that they're trying to compete against virgin plastic, which is so much cheaper. There's different cycles in the market where virgin plastic is more expensive and less expensive dependent on the price of oil. But ultimately, the case has been that chemical recycling struggles to compete with virgin plastic. They're all looking for investment. All of these companies would like to have the solution, but what works okay in the lab doesn't often scale up and become a profit-making commercial reality. And I think what we're looking at now is many startup operations who are partnering with the plastics industry that wants to look like it's doing something about the plastic pollution problem. So there's lots of investment announcements being made, but the reality is that there's not much recycled content coming out of the chemical recycling operations, and they are struggling. So I think we'll continue to see this develop along similar lines, similar trends as we move into the future. And while many of the companies that are trying to establish chemical recycling may have the best of intentions, the marketplace simply causes too many challenges and obstacles for them to proceed and have any meaningful impact on plastic waste.
Thank you very much, Lee, for that answer. And sorry, folks, that's really just the all the time we have for the Q&A portion. Thank you all to our distinguished speakers and panelists, and also our dear participants, for your engagement. And we had a really rich and insightful discussion. So today, we delved into the data and evidence revealing the stark realities behind technologies often promoted as the solutions to the plastic pollution crisis. These findings remind us that addressing the root causes, such as the overproduction of plastics, the toxic chemicals embedded within them, it requires bold, informed decision-making and a commitment to real, sustainable solutions. So as we move closer to finalizing the plastics treaty, we hope today's session equipped you, with valuable insights to inform your work, to inform our work in shaping a robust treaty. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you very much to Jen for organizing this with us. And now I'll turn the floor back to Diana for some closing announcements.
We would like also to thank you, Leah, for the excellent moderation of this event. And indeed, as you have mentioned, we have heard in this session and in previous sessions, that as for other environmental crises, we cannot say we didn't know, we cannot say we can't act. So we wish all those who are traveling to Busan and the INC chair himself and his team our best wishes for a successful outcome of this INC negotiation. I just also wanted to announce here that our next session is taking place, and it's the last one in this series, is taking place this week on Thursday. We are joining our colleagues from the World Health Organization, from IPEN, and from Healthcare Without Harm in a new session where we are looking at the importance of strengthening the health aspects in the future treaty. So we look forward for those of you who can who join us at that session Thursday at 2 p.m. And that session will also be partly in person in Geneva. For those who are in Geneva, don't hesitate to join us at the Environment House. If just this session was streamed, it's available. The recording is already available. So if you saw that some of your friends and colleagues were not able to join us, don't hesitate to share the link of the page of this event where you will find the recording as well as the slides that were presented and some of the key messages. And in a few days, the summary will also be available. So a big thanks to all our panelists. It was a very interesting discussion. We are always learning a lot here. Some of the things, of course, that we know, but we find out always that this is maybe even worse than some of us thought. So thank you very much, and we look forward to have you on board at the next session.
Thank you, Diana and team, Leah, and all speakers. Thank you so much.